Hello, this video from Cost Accounting talks about how to allocate support cost department allocations to other support departments and also to production departments. We're going to go through problem 735 in the Blocher et al. 7th edition cost management text so that you are able to do your homework. So first of all, we said that there are three phases in departmental cost allocation. The first phase is trace direct cost and allocate indirect cost to all departments. So both to the production departments and the service departments like human resource, finance, ordering, etc. The second phase is allocate service department costs to other service departments as well as to production departments. The service department are allocated to other service departments in the step and in the reciprocal method, but they are not allocated to other service departments in the direct method. In phase 2B, all service departments are eventually allocated to production departments. We are not going to discuss the third phase in this problem. So data from problem 735 appears. We have Logan Products has two production departments, assembly and finishing. They are supported by two service departments, the sourcing department, which purchases and handles raw material and administers human resources. There's also an operation department that schedules work, supervises work, and inspects the work. Logan has the following labor hours devoted by each of the service departments to the other departments. So the sourcing department spends 20,000 hours in the operations department, both of which are support departments. But it spends most of its time in assembly and finishing departments, a total of 100,000 in those two production departments. The operations department spends some time doing some scheduling, supervision in the sourcing department, 10,000 out of 120,000 direct labor hours. But again, the operations department spends most of the direct labor hours supporting the two production departments, assembly and finishing. So next thing we're going to look at is not just the labor hours used by the departments, and remember, all costs or all drivers do not have to be labor hours. Sourcing could have one driver, operations could have another one. The cost incurred in the plant are as follows. For sourcing, 165,000, for operations, 205,000, for assembly, 410,000, and for finishing, 255,000, for a total of $1.035 million. So before we get to phase 1, and I always say this in these allocation problems, calculate the totals for the department allocation bases and the relative percentages of each department's direct labor hours that are allocated to servicing the others. So I would always put a total. So the department allocation bases happen to both be direct labor hours for the sourcing department and the operations department. One could use machine hours, one could use labor hours, one could use machine parts or batches. It doesn't have to be that way. So we said that the sourcing department spends 20,000 of the 120,000 direct labor hours in its department helping out the operations department. That is 16.7%. Most of the time, 83% is spent helping the assembly and finishing departments. So 120,000 hours or 100% of its time is spent either helping the operations department, the assembly, and the finishing department. The operations department spends 10,000 out of 120,000 hours or 8.3% of its time helping the sourcing department. The rest of its direct labor hours are spent supporting the assembly and finishing production departments. So it's only a coincidence that both service departments use direct labor hours for allocation. It's not much more difficult if they use two different bases. And that both have 120,000 estimated direct labor hours. Just a coincidence. Okay, we're going to trace direct cost in phase 1 and allocate indirect cost to all departments. This is really easy. Unlike the examples in your book and in your chapter 7 lecture notes, all we're going to do is trace the direct cost to the sourcing and operations department, which are support or service departments, and to the producing departments, assembly and finishing. So the 1,035,000, there are no indirect costs to trace among these four. We only did phase 1A, as you will do in your homework and as you will do on your test. So what do we do with the direct method? The phase 2 direct method, we allocate service department cost as if the only time they spend is on production departments. So for the sourcing department, 33% of its time is spent servicing the assembly department, 50% of its time is spent servicing the finishing departments. In total, 83.3% of its time is spent servicing these two departments. Ignoring the 16.67% that it spends servicing the operation department, let's figure out the relative percentage of time it spends in each production department. So 33.33% divided by 83.33% is 40%. Another way to do that would be to go back. The sourcing department spends 40,000 hours in assembly and 60,000 hours in finishing. So in the producing departments, they spend 100,000 direct labor hours, 40,000 in sourcing, 60,000 in finishing. Again, you get 40% and 60%. Your book tells you to round percentages to 4 decimal places. So if I know that the service department cost from phase 1 is 165,000, I will multiply that by the 40% of hours spent in production departments are spent in assembly. That gives me $66,000. 60% of the 165,000 that is spent in the finishing department, and that's 99,000. So we're ignoring the fact that they spend in the sourcing department about 17% of direct labor hours helping operations. It's just keeping it simple. With the operations department, our costs from phase 1 were 205,000. We're going to split that. We said that 50% of the total time, total direct labor hours, is spent in production department assembly. The other 41.7% is spent in the finishing department. So 91% of its direct labor hours are either spent in the production department called assembly or the production department that does finishing. So 91.7% of its time, other than the 8.3% that it spends helping the sourcing department. So let's look at a relative percentage of its direct labor hours spent on production. So it spends a little more than half, 50% over 91.7%, which is 54.54%, on the assembly department. Of the direct labor hours, it spends a little less than half supporting the finishing department. So the operations department spends relatively more time in the assembly department than the finishing department, but a significant and somewhat comparable time in both. So now the cost of production departments from phase 1, 410,000 for assembly. We're going to allocate operation cost of 110,818 from the operations department to the assembly department. We're going to allocate 66,000 from the sourcing department to the assembly department. So all of a sudden now, once we get rid of the cost in the service departments and place them in the production department, we have $587,818 in the service department, some of it from the sourcing department, in the assembly department, some of it from the sourcing department, some of it from the operations department. The finishing department gets $99,000 of the sourcing cost allocated to it. It uses more sourcing costs relative to the assembly department, and it gets a slightly less amount of the cost of the operations department allocated to it, $93,182. Adding the $99,000 plus the $93,182 to the original cost of the finishing department from phase 1 of $255,000, now we have $447,182. The total for production departments after the service departments are allocated is the $1,035,000 of total cost. So the direct method requires recalculation of the service department percentage of the cost drivers. And again, it's not as good because it ignores reciprocal flows of costs between the sourcing and operations departments. A little better way to do this in phase 2 is the step method. We allocate service department costs to some service departments. So we do a little bit of phase 2A, allocating service department costs to service departments, and all of phase 2B, allocating service departments to production departments. So let's look at phase 1. Costs from the servicing department, costs from the sourcing service department are allocated to the operations service department first because it is a bigger percentage. So if you remember, the sourcing department spends 20,000 hours or 17 approximately % of its time supporting the operations department. Also, if you remember, the sourcing department only spends about 8.3% of its time helping the sourcing department. The operations department spends 8.3% of its time helping the sourcing department. Usually we start with the department with the highest allocation. 17% beats 8%. So we allocate the sourcing department since it has a higher percentage of service costs to operations. So allocate the $165,000 costs from phase 1 from the sourcing department to the operations department, the assembly department, and the finishing department. Now we're going to allocate the service department, but we only are going to allocate the service department since it already contains some costs from the sourcing department. We're only going to allocate it to the next 2 departments going forward. So the sourcing department the operations department now has cost, instead of the $205,000 in phase 1, it has a step allocation of $27,500, leading to a new cost, phase 1 plus the step allocation of $232,500. We'll use the relative percentage of the time, direct labor hours, spent on production. 55% of the operations department's time is spent on the service department. 45% is spent on the finishing department. So operation is spent about 55% to assembly department, 45% to the finishing department. So we allocate, instead of $205,000, now $232,500 after allocating part 1 of the step method. And we still add that to the original cost from phase 1 for the assembly and finishing departments. So there's $55,000 from the sourcing department to the assembly department, $126,818 from the operations department, including its share, operations department share of the service department of the sourcing department, and then the original cost. Still, what we've done is take the cost out of the support department, the service departments, and put them into the two producing departments, which are assembly and finishing. This is better, but still the cost of the service given by the operations department to the sourcing department is ignored. The best way to recognize the service given between support departments is using the reciprocal method, which involves either doing a bit of algebra or using the solver function in Excel. What we recognized is that the sourcing department has its cost from phase 1 plus 8.3% of the operations cost from phase 1. The operations department has $205,000 in costs from phase 1, plus about 17% of the cost should be allocated from the sourcing department. We can now express, since operations cost can be expressed in terms of sourcing cost, we can now substitute the operations cost into the sourcing cost. So sourcing costs are now $165,000 plus 8.3%, but instead of saying 8.3% of operations cost, it's 8.3% times, in parentheses, $205,000 phase 1 operations cost plus 16.667% of the sourcing cost. If you multiply this out, get the sourcing cost on the left side of the equation, the dollars on the right, divide to get the sourcing cost, you will get that the sourcing, the phase 1 cost allocation plus the reciprocal allocation from the operations department should be $184,648. Compare that to before, just in phase 1, it had a allocation of, it had a cost traced in phase 1 of $165,000. So now it has a share of, the sourcing department has a share of the operations department cost. The operations department has its cost from phase 1 plus a reciprocal allocation from the sourcing department. So instead of having $205,000 in phase 1, it has a share of the cost from the sourcing department, increasing it to $235,000. So first, solve the simultaneous equations to get the adjusted amount for sourcing and operations, taking into account reciprocal allocation. Second, once you do that, take the adjusted amounts for the sourcing department, which have the reciprocal allocation, and allocate it using the percent of total direct labor hours to the production department. So we know that the sourcing department spends 83.3333% of its time supporting assembly and finishing. Because the operations allocation is taken care of in step 1, we can just multiply sourcing plus reciprocal allocation of operations times the percent of direct labor hours. $184,648 times 33.3333%. For the finishing department, take the same number, $184,648 times 50% of the cost. That gives you $92,324. For the operations department, take the adjusted amount operations cost from phase 1 plus the reciprocal allocation from the sourcing department in the first step of the reciprocal method. Now we have $235,775 to allocate between the producing departments, assembly and finishing. That means $117,887 goes to the assembly department, since 50% of its costs go there, and 41% of its costs go to the production department called finishing. What the remaining 8.3% was already allocated in the first part of the reciprocal method. So This is a better way to do it. Once you recognize reciprocal costs between service departments, you just allocate the revised service department cost using the original percentage. There's no need to revise the percentage as in the direct method. If we look, did it matter much? Not in this case. So maybe if you don't expect there to be a big difference because there's not a lot of inter-service department allocations, it might not make much of a difference. What we still have to do in any of these three methods is take the costs from the service departments and allocate them to assembly and finishing, and we want to use a logical basis that has a relationship. Neither this problem, 735, nor your homework exercise, 728, nor your exam requires you to complete Phase 3, which is the allocation of the production department costs from assembly and finishing to the final products. Hopefully you have an idea about support department cost allocation. Please feel free to review this presentation before doing Chapter 7 Departmental Cost Allocation homework and before the exam. Good luck. Get started, Jaspers.